I was still hooked up to a heart monitor 41 hours after emergency bypass surgery when my phone buzzed on the tray table beside my bed. It was a text message. Not meant for me. LOL, Dad's basically comatose. Let's just move the money now while we can split it 50/50ths before the hospital bills eat into it. My son Trevor had meant to send that to his twin brother, Tyler. He hit my name in his contacts by mistake instead. The two of us are listed one after the other, Dad and Dad's cell, and apparently at 11 o'clock at night, half asleep and thinking his father was too sedated to ever see it, he simply grabbed the wrong line. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the tray table, closed my eyes, and did something my sons would have been very surprised to learn I was capable of doing at that exact moment. I started planning. My name is Harold. I'm 67 years old, and for 34 years, I worked as an insurance claims adjuster, a career nobody ever mistook for glamorous, but one that taught me something most people never learn until it's too late. The difference between what looks protected and what actually is. I spent my career reading policies for a living, looking for the gap between what a document appeared to promise and what it actually covered once a real crisis hit. I watched hundreds of families discover, at the worst possible moment, that the coverage they assumed they had wasn't the coverage they actually had. I promised myself, fairly early in that career, that I would never let my own family discover a gap like that about me. My wife, Carol, passed away 8 years ago, quickly and unexpectedly, from an aneurysm that gave us no warning and no time to prepare. It was the single most disorienting month of my life, made worse by discovering, in the weeks afterward, just how many of our joint financial decisions I never fully understood because Carol had quietly handled most of them. I decided, in the middle of that grief, that I would never again let my own affairs be a mystery to the people who might one day need to step into them. But I also decided, with equal firmness, that I would control exactly how and when that stepping in was allowed to happen. So I did something most people my age never bothered doing properly. I met with an estate attorney and a fiduciary firm, and over about 4 months, I restructured everything I owned. The bulk of my retirement savings, pension payouts, investment accounts, the proceeds from selling the family hardware store I'd inherited from my own father and sold years earlier, went into an irrevocable trust, just over $2.3 million at the time, with a professional co-trustee, a firm called Ashcroft Fiduciary Partners, named to act alongside me. Critically, I built in a specific trigger. If I ever became medically incapacitated, verified by 2 independent physicians, the trust would automatically lock into a protected mode, requiring Ashcroft sign-off on every transaction, with no exceptions, regardless of who held power of attorney over my day-to-day medical decisions. My attorney at the time, an older gentleman named Preston who'd handled estate work for 40 years, told me something during those planning sessions that stuck with me more than almost any advice I'd received in my own career. He said the families who came to him after a crisis, wanting to add protections retroactively, almost always had one thing in common. They'd assumed love and access were the same thing, right up until a hospital bed proved otherwise. I remember telling him, half joking, that my boys would never need that kind of protection built against them. He didn't argue with me. He just said, gently, that the protection wasn't really about predicting anyone's character. It was about making sure a moment of panic in anyone never had the chance to become an irreversible mistake. Alongside that trust, I kept a much smaller operational account, about $40,000, later closer to $60,000, as I kept it topped up for ordinary living expenses, bill pay, and crucially, something I genuinely intended as a safety net. Quick access for my sons in case they ever needed to cover an emergency expense on my behalf, like a hospital copay or a home repair, without waiting on trust paperwork. I'd shared the login for that account with both boys years earlier, back when Tyler helped me set up automatic bill pay after a minor stroke scare in my early 60s. It felt at the time like ordinary precaution. I never imagined it would become the exact account my own sons would empty the moment they believed I might not wake up. Trevor and Tyler are 36, identical twins who have spent their entire lives locked in a quiet, exhausting competition that started, as far as I can tell, somewhere around their 6th birthday and never fully stopped. Trevor works in commercial real estate, chasing deals that never quite close as big as he describes them at family dinners. Tyler manages a mid-sized auto dealership, steady but perpetually convinced he deserves the general manager position that keeps going to someone else. Neither of them is a bad person, and I want to be clear about that before I tell you the rest of this story, because it would be easy to make them into cartoon villains, and that isn't the truth. What they are is two men who have spent their adult lives comparing their financial situations against each other, and against a version of success neither of them is quite caught up to, and somewhere in that exhausting comparison, they developed a habit of viewing my modest, steady savings as a kind of neutral resource. Not really mine anymore, in some psychological sense, so much as a pot that would eventually be divided, and that the sooner it got divided, the sooner one of them could finally get ahead of the other. I noticed the habit forming years before the hospital. Small requests. At first, Trevor needing a bridge loan for a deal that fell through. 6 months without repayment before I quietly let it go. Tyler asking more than once whether I'd consider gifting early some of what he called his eventual inheritance to help with a down payment, phrased always as a practical financial planning question rather than what it actually was. There's one dinner, about 2 years before the surgery, that I think back on now as the clearest warning sign I chose not to fully absorb. The boys were arguing, half joking, about what they'd each do with their half. Once I was gone, Trevor wanted to expand into commercial development. Tyler wanted to open his own dealership. I sat at the head of the table, technically still very much alive, listening to my sons plan the disposal of my life's work, as though I were already a formality, standing between them and the starting gun. I laughed along with them that night, the way you laugh at something you've decided not to examine too closely. I told myself it was harmless, the kind of dark humor families use to cope with the idea of loss before it actually arrives. A few months after that dinner, Tyler called me on a Sunday afternoon and asked almost casually whether I'd ever considered adding both boys as joint owners on my main accounts, just to simplify things down the road. I told him I'd think about it, and I never followed up, though I noticed he brought it up again in slightly different words at least twice more over the following year. Looking back, I think that request was less about convenience and more about testing whether the door was open. I never opened it. I've often wondered, since the hospital, whether that quiet refusal is part of what made the operational account feel, to both of them, like the only door they had left. If you've ever watched people you love discuss your death with more enthusiasm and discomfort, you understand exactly why I started paying closer attention after that dinner, and exactly why, 18 months later, when a genuinely serious health crisis finally arrived, I wasn't nearly as surprised by what happened next as I probably should have let myself appear. The heart attack hit on a Tuesday morning, in my own kitchen, severe enough that the paramedics told Trevor afterward that another 20 minutes without intervention likely would have been fatal. I don't remember much of the first 2 days. Emergency bypass surgery, a medically induced period of heavy sedation, the ordinary chaos of an ICU. Trevor and Tyler, to their credit, showed up fast, coordinated with my doctors, and handled the medical power of attorney paperwork exactly the way responsible sons should. What they didn't know, what I'd genuinely never gotten around to explaining clearly to either of them, in another one of those long postponed conversations I now deeply regret postponing, was the difference between the medical power of attorney they just activated and the financial structure sitting underneath it. In their minds, in the panicked, sleep-deprived haze of those first 2 days, Dad might not make it translated directly into the money situation needs to be handled now, before things get complicated. I've since pieced together, mostly from bank records and from Trevor's own eventual, reluctant account, what happened over those 41 hours. Using the login I'd shared years earlier for bill pay convenience, Tyler logged into the operational account the first night, intending, he later claimed, only to make sure the hospital bills would be covered. By the second night, in a text exchange I've now read in its entirety, the conversation between my sons had shifted from covering medical bills to something else entirely, a hurried, half-panicked, half-opportunistic agreement to transfer the account's full balance, just over $61,000, into two separate accounts, split evenly, just in case, before, as Trevor put it in the message I was never supposed to see, the hospital or the state tries to freeze anything. They believed, genuinely and completely, that they had just split the whole of my retirement savings. Neither of them had any idea Ashcroft Fiduciary Partners existed. Neither of them had any idea that the moment my second physician signed off on my incapacitation determination, which happened, per hospital protocol, roughly 6 hours before that misdirected text arrived on my phone, a much larger, much more carefully protected structure had already, automatically, locked itself down. I want to be honest about what I felt, lying in that hospital bed, reading a message meant for someone else. It wasn't shock, not really. It was something closer to a quiet, exhausted confirmation of a fear I'd been carrying, unspoken, since that dinner 2 years earlier. My sons hadn't needed a crisis to reveal who they were. The crisis had simply removed the polite performance that usually sat on top of it. I lay there for a long while that night, the monitor beside me tracking a heartbeat that had nearly stopped 41 hours earlier, and I thought about Preston's warning again, the one about love and access. I thought about how easy it would have been to simply confront them the moment I was strong enough to speak, to demand an apology in a moment of raw, understandable anger, and let the whole thing dissolve into a shouting match neither of us would fully remember accurately a year later. I decided, somewhere around 3 in the morning, that I didn't want a shouting match. I wanted my sons to understand, clearly and permanently, the actual shape of what they'd done and what it had cost them, in a way that no amount of yelling from a hospital bed could ever make land as effectively as the truth itself would. I was discharged 11 days later, weaker than I'd like to admit, and I spent the first week home mostly resting, saying very little to either son about what I knew. I wanted to be steady enough, physically and otherwise, to handle the conversation properly, rather than having it from a hospital bed in a moment of understandable anger. I called Ashcroft Fiduciary Partners as soon as I felt strong enough, and my primary contact there, a careful, unflappable woman named Renata Okafor, walked me through exactly what the incapacitation trigger had done in real time. Locked the trust, flagged the required physician sign-offs, and per the protocol I'd built in years earlier specifically for a scenario like this, generated a full report of all activity across every account linked to my estate during the incapacitation window, including the operational account my sons had assumed was invisible to anyone but the two of them. I asked Renata to set up a meeting, myself, both boys, and Ashcroft compliance attorney, and I told my sons only that we needed to discuss some paperwork from the hospitalization. I watched the same relief cross both their faces that I'd watched cross Marcus's face in a similar meeting I've told you about before. The relief of two men who believed they were about to formalize something rather than answer for it. Renata didn't waste time once we were seated. She confirmed, calmly and for the record, that the operational account, $61,218, had been emptied over a 41-hour window during my medically documented incapacitation, split evenly between two accounts belonging to Trevor and Tyler Bennett, using login credentials neither of them had current legal authority to use for that purpose. Since medical power of attorney does not, under state law, extend to independent financial account access absent, a separately executed financial power of attorney, which I had never granted either of them, Then she told them about the trust. Your father's actual retirement holdings, she said, just over $2.4 million as of last quarter's valuation, are held in an irrevocable trust that locked into protected status the moment his incapacitation was medically confirmed, 6 hours per the timestamp, before either of you accessed the operational account. Neither of you has ever had access to it, and nothing that happened during his hospitalization changed that. I watched my son's faces do something I've come to recognize now, having watched it happen once before in a very different context. The specific, sinking recalculation of two men realizing that the crisis they'd acted on, the now or never urgency that had justified everything to themselves at 11 o'clock at night, had been aimed at a decoy the whole time, while the thing they actually believed they were racing to protect had never been within their reach at all. You're saying we stole 60 grand, Tyler said slowly, out of an account that wasn't even the real money. I'm saying, Renata replied, that you accessed funds without legal authority during a period when your father was medically unable to consent, which is under this state's elder financial abuse statute, a prosecutable offense, regardless of the total amount involved or what account it came from. Trevor didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at me. And for the first time since I'd woken up in that hospital bed, I watched something other than justification cross his face, something closer to the beginning of genuine shame. Tyler, beside him, kept glancing between Renata and the folder in front of him, as if rereading the numbers might change what they added up to. Neither of them looked at each other, which struck me as its own kind of answer. Whatever version of teamwork had produced that 11 o'clock text message clearly hadn't survived contact with the truth. I want to tell you honestly that I did not pursue criminal charges, though Renata made clear I had every legal right to. I sat with that decision for almost 2 weeks before the meeting, and I came to it the same way I've come to every difficult decision in this family. Not from softness, but from a clear sense of what actually served the relationship I still, despite everything, wanted to try to repair. What I did instead was require full repayment, on a structured schedule, with a formal written acknowledgement from both boys. Not a vague apology, but a specific, detailed accounting of what happened and why, reviewed by Renata's office and kept on permanent file with the trust. I also made a change to the trust itself. Going forward, any future distribution to either son would be contingent on a documented pattern of financial responsibility, reviewed annually by Ashcroft, rather than an automatic inheritance triggered by nothing but my eventual death. Tyler paid back his half within 4 months, and more than that, he showed up at my house on a Sunday about 6 weeks after the meeting and said something I hadn't expected. That reading his own text back in Renata's office, in front of an attorney, had been the first time in his adult life he'd had to see his relationship with money from outside his own head, and that what he'd seen had genuinely frightened him. He's been seeing a financial therapist since, a real thing, apparently, and one I wish I'd known to suggest years earlier. Trevor took longer, and our relationship, if I'm honest, is still the more careful of the two. He repaid his share in full, on schedule, but the conversations since have stayed clipped, more like business than family, and I've decided not to force more out of him than he's ready to give. Some repairs happen on a timeline you don't get to control, no matter how much you want to. As for the operational account, I closed it entirely. I keep a much smaller cushion now, in an account only I can access, and I've finally had the long conversation with both of my sons that I should have had years ago, laying out exactly how the trust works, exactly what Ashcroft's role is, and exactly what I expect from both of them going forward, in plain language, with no more room left for convenient assumptions. I think often about Preston's warning from all those years ago about love and access being two different things. I understand it differently now than I did when he first said it. I don't believe my sons stopped loving me the moment I went under anesthesia. I believe panic and opportunity, given 41 unsupervised hours and a shared login, revealed something about both of them that ordinary daily life had simply never had reason to surface. That's a harder thing to sit with than simple betrayal would have been, because it means the answer isn't to love them less carefully. It means building the kind of structure that lets me keep loving them exactly as much, without ever again handing either of them a door I wasn't prepared to see them walk through. Here's what 34 years of reading fine print for a living taught me. In the end, more clearly than it ever taught me on the job. The gap between what looks protected and what actually is doesn't only exist in insurance policies. It exists in families too, in the quiet space between what you assume the people you love would do in a crisis and what they actually do when they believe no one is watching closely enough to see it. I built a structure to protect my money from exactly that gap. I wish now I'd built the same kind of clarity into my relationships years before a hospital bed ever forced the conversation. If you've ever discovered the hard way that someone's love for you had a price tag attached that you never knew about, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there are a lot more quiet plans and a lot more overdue reckonings still to come. I'll see you in the next one.